All right, so welcome everyone. This is a presentation today of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program's 2018 SGMA Basin Prioritization Process and Draft Results. My name is Trevor Joseph. I'm one of the program leads here for the Department of Water Resources. I'm joined here by my colleagues Stephen Springhorn and Roy Hull. In addition, Steph Horry, who is a consultant helping us today with our webinar broadcast. One moment while we advance the slides. Today, we're going to focus on some instructions related to the webinar. Stephanie will go over that. I'm going to provide a presentation, a few slides over providing the overview of basin prioritization, some of the history and requirements. Roy Hull, the project manager, is going to go through an overview of the actual 2018 SGMA Basin Prioritization process. And finally, Stephen will provide some information on resources and next steps. And then we'll open the webinar for a question and answer session.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Horry with Sacramento State, the Collaboration Consensus Program. I'm just going to take a quick moment to go over how you can interact and provide clarifying questions during today's webinar. As you can see on the slides, today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted after today on DWR's events webpage. Now, for submitting questions for clarification, you can submit your questions at any time during today's webinar via the questions box there indicated on your webinar control panel. DWR staff will be keeping a queue of those questions, and when we get into the clarifying question and Q&A period, they will read your questions aloud. For those of you who plan to call in only, you can email me to receive a copy of the presentation slides, so that way you're able to follow along. That email is spelled s.horii@csus.edu. It's going to be that same email address that you received when you registered for the webinar. And again, webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the webpage that for those of you watching the webinar is on your screen. So, and in general, if you are experiencing technical difficulties, feel free to reach out to me and I will help you as best as I can. With that, I will turn it over to Trevor.
Okay, great. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I will provide some background, some history, and kind of the legislative intent of the Basin Prioritization Project. First, I'm actually going to start out with the draft results. So this is a map depicting the 517 groundwater basins or subbasins throughout the state. A little hard to see perhaps at this scale, but all of the orange colored areas are high or medium priority basins, which have a special significance in the SGMP program and the SGMA program. We will touch on that. The other basins shown in kind of a light green are low or very low, and then the hatch pattern are adjudicated areas, also have kind of special requirements under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. As I mentioned, there's 517 groundwater basins or subbasins throughout the state currently, and we've gone through a basin prioritization process and have draft results that we will present the process and the information today. But the bottom line from a statewide perspective is there were not significant changes from prior prioritization results, meaning approximately 10% of the basins or subbasins changed priority statewide. Of course, we recognize that there's a lot of significance in terms of some of these changes at an individual basin scale and can certainly appreciate that. Currently, based on these draft results, the high and medium priority basins and adjudicated areas represent approximately 98% of the groundwater use overlying or from those 517 groundwater basins, and represent approximately 83% of the population that overlies those 517 groundwater basins or subbasins. So here's a timeline to characterize the major milestones related to basin prioritization. So first, important to note that basin boundaries are documented and defined in Bulletin 118. The last comprehensive Bulletin 118 that the department has prepared was back in 2003. Another significant milestone was the passage of Senate Bill X76, which really established the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program, requiring the groundwater elevations be monitored seasonally. As I mentioned, the SGMP program was initiated back in the 2010 timeframe, really identified the extent groundwater elevation monitoring was required in each basin and directed DWR to prioritize basins. Fast forward a little bit, the last basin prioritization related to the SGMP program was what we call the 2014 basin prioritization that was done in accordance with the requirements of Water Code 10,933. SGMP became effective January 1st, 2015. One of the significant requirements SGMP identified was some addition, added text to the Water Code 10,933 that describes the specific requirements or criteria that the department needs to evaluate when considering prioritization. In addition, SGMP required that DWR identify prioritization of basins by January 31st, 2015 for initial determination of which basins are required to form groundwater sustainability agencies and groundwater sustainability plans. At that time, DWR adopted the SGMP 2014 prioritization as the initial prioritization for that purpose. DWR also modified basin boundaries under under basin boundary regulations, emergency regulations. Those boundaries were finalized in the fall 2016 timeframe, and we incorporated numerous statewide, jurisdictional, and scientific modifications at that time. DWR then completed and published an interim update of Bulletin 118-16, which provides, again, those documented and defined basin boundaries. This has led to the 2018 SGMP basin prioritization results, draft results that were released about a week and a half ago. I will get into the description of the legislative requirements in terms of why we've updated basin prioritization on a subsequent slide. Of course, from a SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act perspective, the Act clearly describes the requirements for GSA, groundwater sustainability agencies, to prepare groundwater sustainability plans by certain deadlines. For basins that are subject to critically conditions of overdraft, that deadline is January 31st, 2020. For all other high and medium priority basins, that deadline is January 31st, 2022. And of course, those basins have 20 years to reach sustainability. It should be noted that SGMA also identifies a different timeline for basins that change priority to high and medium as a result of basin prioritization. And so, as I've mentioned, these are draft results at this time. Stephen will touch on the next steps, but when these results become final, there will be different timelines for any basins that have moved to high and medium priority status. So the legislative direction under SGMA is articulated here. One, SGMA requires that we reassess the priority of the state's groundwater basins when basin boundaries defined in Bulletin 118 have been modified. In addition, the Water Code 10,933 was amended with SGMA to include adverse impacts on local habitat and stream flow. Third bullet indicates part of that Water Code section that describes that the department can look at other information determined relevant when completing basin prioritization. And finally, DWR has an obligation to look at updated data sets and information related to the provision to the extent data are available. I should mention at this time that related to that third bullet with the SGMA 2018 prioritization process, the department looked at 4 factors that were not looked at the time of the 2014 CASGEM prioritization. Other information that we determined relevant with the 2018 SGMA prioritization included the adverse impacts on local habitat and stream flows, looking at adjudicated areas and the non-adjudicated portions of basins where there are adjudicated areas, critically overdrafted status of basins, and groundwater-related transfers. And Roy will touch on more details related to these 4 additional factors on a subsequent slide. So, Water Code 10,933, the code that we need to follow in completion of our basin prioritization process includes 1, the population overlying the basin, the projected growth related to the population, number of public supply wells that draw water from the basin, total number of wells that draw from the basin, irrigated acreage, the degree that the basins or persons overlying the basin rely on groundwater as the primary source of water, documented impacts. There are some additional details there in terms of what type of documented impacts. And then the aforementioned other information that we deemed relevant, including the adverse impacts on local habitat and stream flow. Again, Roy will touch on the process we used for each of those 8 components or criteria in Water Code. I'll pass it over to Roy.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Roy Hall, and I'm going to cover all the different data sets. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the process because most of it is documented in the document that you can download from the website. But one of the things I do want to cover is a lot of the different data sets and how they related to constructing the basin prioritization of 2018. As I said, here's the document. It's available, the website, on our website. You can download it. It has all the pertinent information concerning each of the different components broken down by component, subcomponent levels, as well as any available appendices and things like that to help support the information provided. Okay, I'm going to cover these in the order that they are covered in the technical document and also in the Water Code that Trevor just went through. On some of these, though, like on the population and population growth, a lot of the data was similar and shared in the process was similar, so I'm going to cover them at the same time. Again, population overlying the basin or subbasin, we used 2010, and we used the United States Census block data. The biggest challenge there was intersecting those population blocks with respect to groundwater basin boundaries. But that was basically the data set we used and the process we used for calculating both 2000 and 2010. When we went into the rate of current and projected growth for the population overlying the groundwater basin, we had to do a few more things. I mean, we used 2030 back in 2014, basin prioritization. So to maintain consistency between the 2 different prioritizations, we maintained 2030 as well in this process. In that process, there was a big effort to try to maintain with what we are projecting with respect to the California Water Plan, and they do all their processing on a hydrologic region and county hydrologic region levels. So all we did in this process was basically inserted groundwater basins and reallocated all the different populations in the tables from the county Department of Finance, so that when we were all done between basin and non-basin area within a hydrologic region, came out to the same predictions that the water plan predicts for the particular hydrologic region. So it was more of a check and balance type process. Public supply wells. We worked with the department, the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Drinking Water. We worked with the folks there back in 2016 to secure the data set that is behind all their public drinking water systems, where they both collect information both on availability as well as water quality. So they provided us with their data that they had, and it's roughly about 17,000 different public supply wells throughout the state. By the time we were done with it, with what was in groundwater basins, the number was roughly about 11,000 wells are scattered throughout the 517 basins. That data set is going to be available on our segment Basin Prioritization open portal website. If it's not there yet, it will be there shortly, within the next couple days. But you'll be able to download it. And then it's sorted, it's an Excel spreadsheet. Each one of those spreadsheets, so it'll be a zip file, and it'll be based off of the State Water Resources Control Board. They have divisions, regions for the Regional Water Quality Board, which also corresponds to our basin ID. So when you see a 1-001, that means it's the regional board zone 1. Anyway, they're all broken up into 1 through 9. So if your basin starts with a 4, look for the 4s. And they'll all be available here in the next couple of days. Production wells. We pulled the data on this particular requirement from our OSCAR, which is the online system for well completion reports. We pulled it back in February 2017 at the conclusion of, they had a huge effort to digitize, scan, and key a lot of well logs that were not previously in our previous system. So I was waiting until that was completed. After they added about another 200,000 or 300,000 well logs, then we kind of pulled that system out. Our well logs are all categorized and labeled and spatially down to township range section in most cases. So that means each one of those wells that are identified in that log, at a minimum, is 1 square mile. We know where that well is. So that kind of led to how many of them are in the basin when they are in 1 square mile at a minimum. Some of them are even much greater than that because they only give us township range, which then means that well is somewhere within 36 square miles. So with the use of the public land survey system for mapping these and county and assessor parcel numbers, we were using all the clues we could possibly do to try to figure out where these wells were located within any reasonable certainty of 1 square mile. Now, the sections which are identified in the public land system are either one of two things, and the document goes into this a little bit more than what I'm going to go into here. It's either completely within a basin, which means all the wells that are identified within that section are assigned to that basin. And if it crosses a boundary, say between two basins, then we simply did a proportion between the two. And in some cases it was 3 basins, in other cases it's somewhere in and out of basins. So we only allocated a portion of those, but we don't know exactly which wells are in where within that section. So that was the best we could zero in on that. The parcel numbers would allow us to go into a little bit more parcel numbers, or parcel locations, and be able to identify where these wells are actually. That complete data set, again, will be in a zip file that you'll be able to download for the whole state here in the next few days. I have a preliminary copy of it. I need to go through and do some QC on it. before I can post it. So the soonest it would get up there would be tomorrow, but it would probably be either later this week or first of next week. Same website, same location. Before I go off of that, then the next piece of information about that particular process would be, after we figured out where they were, then the next step would be, were they production wells or were they monitoring wells? You need to understand that these well logs are submitted by drillers and other entities, and they're not always clear exactly what the well use is, or was unreadable, or it was a faded copy, things like that. There's a lot of reasons for that. So we had to come up with a couple of different analysts, basically looked at the information provided to be able to make a determination based off well depth, screening intervals, gallons per minute, casing sizes, things like that help us identify what is obviously a production well versus what is obviously a monitoring well or a non-producing well. Irrigated acreage. We worked with Land IQ and we developed, let's step back a little bit further. Back in 2014, we used basically exclusively DWR surveys for all the land use. But they don't cover the same year. They are over a span of years across the state. So it was really difficult for us to get a more accurate, consistent snapshot so that we can do a fair assessment across all 517 basins. So we worked with Land IQ, who did a remote sensing for us, to basically map the entire state of California for us for a particular year. And the first year that they provided us data was 2014, which was also very good because it also is that transition before, it was the transition of pre-Sigma and post-Sigma. So it was worked out really nice from that standpoint. That data set has been available for download, and it's available for anybody. The website is on the bottom here. It's been there for the last 7 or 8 months. And we use that data set for both this particular component, but it was also used in the groundwater reliance section of this processing. All the land mapped in that particular data set is considered irrigated acreage. We did do some post-processing on the basin prioritization data on places where we knew there was dry farming that was not evidently clear from remote sensing. And we also made some adjustments on some pasture lands that are not irrigated. They're also kind of like dry farming. Anyway, so those were post-processing that only applied to basin prioritization, but currently all that data is still up there, as is. Groundwater reliance. There's actually 2 pieces to this. One is the volume of groundwater that is used by the basin, and the other one is the percent of that groundwater is reliant upon in that groundwater basin. Essentially, we call it 6A, and then 6B is the percent. 6A drives 6B, so we didn't do anything special with 6B other than take the results of 6A and do the calculations for percents. But anyway, so 6A is broken into agricultural and urban. I'll cover the agricultural first. Again, we use that Land IQ statewide cropping map from 2014 to identify all the crops in the basin and all the acreage. And then through the calcimitar, we developed by basin all the unit values for all the crops that basically 1 acre of X crop uses this much water within that basin. And from that, then we basically took the cropping maps and the totals to determine the applied water. And then using the work that they've been working on with respect to the Water Plan 2018, we used their water balance information to try to determine what is the ratio between surface water and groundwater. So that's where that information came On the urban was a little bit more complicated. We had to use quite a few more different data sets to get to where we wanted to be with that one. The first was what we call the DWR Public Water System Statistics Database, which is actually a pull from the Water Board. All the purveyors are required to produce annual reports that has a lot of different pieces of data that they're required to report. And we generally just pull the water-related information, at least for what I use it for. And it sits in a database that we use here. We also do some quality assurance on some of that data, quality control, to fix a few things that are actually not correct, like, units. If it's supposed to be an acre feet and somebody supplies gallons, so we do a lot of the conversion to clean that up. Water purveyor boundaries. They come from multiple sources, whether it's supplied by the actual water purveyors, or they're created by us, or they're created by somebody else. Anyway, they come from multiple sources. These are all the different water district boundaries. Then we created an urban layer that was a little bit more detailed than what you're going to find in your traditional urban layers that you can download from various sources. We started with DWR land use surveys because they're highly detailed with respect to where urban is located, and so we used any surveys that were done between 2000 and 2014 that mapped out urban layers. That was the primary data set that we used, and then we backfilled anything that came out of USDA Cropscape crop layer that was mapped as urban. So then between those two data sets, we were able to have a pretty good idea of where all the urban is in there. So you're asking, so what do we need that for? And that is a very good question. Let's say we use that to fine-tune a lot of the urban purveyor layers that we had, because most of them are, not most of them, but there's quite a few of them that they're just they're block areas. While there's areas within those urban, those purveyor areas that are not serviced, they're either parks or they're undeveloped, things of that nature. And we have to be able to understand, because most of these water purveyors they're not always located completely within a groundwater basin. They straddle multiple basins, and they can also straddle non-basin areas. So to get an accurate representation of the actual area, we needed to exclude some of the areas that are basically undeveloped. The next part that we had to do, we had to estimate population. So we used a tool that's documented in the draft manual that basically created a 2014 population estimate for us, because that's really critical for us to determine how much the urban users are providing to. So if you have 20,000 people living in the basin and the urban providers are only supplying 10,000, that means there's roughly 10,000 people that are on self-supply. So we needed to be able to break that down in that fashion, because there are self-suppliers, and both domestic and commercial, that we had to take into consideration. So between that and the urban purveyors, we were able to determine how much water was being used and supplied for urban needs, groundwater. Before I go. So anyway, these two data sets were basically, the groundwater volume was added together from both ag and urban, and then we basically coupled it up, and we ran it through the breakpoints that were pretty standard and consistent with all the previous basin prioritization. And then we took the total water demand for both ag and urban to come up with a whole total water demand, and then we just basically did the simple divide to come up with percent for groundwater volume. Documented impacts. We broke that into 4 separate categories, A, B, C, and D. Please excuse me if I keep referring to A, B, C. I'm sure you're not familiar with them as much as I am. But anyway, A is basically referencing overdraft in the water code, groundwater level decline in hours. B would be the subsidence, C would be the salient intrusion, and D would cover the water quality degradation process. So I'll cover each one, A, B, C, and D. Data sets for the groundwater decline was a research project, essentially looking through all the well logs that we have, all the water level data that we have both in CASGEM and Water Data Library. We looked at information that we could find with respect to the groundwater water plan update for 2013 that we worked on, as well as published documents, both regional and local. Right now, there's just for all four of these categories, there's a downloadable spreadsheet with all the information concerning all the documented impacts. So it's either a document that we possess here, or it's a document that is linked outside to an outside source. Currently, what we're doing is pulling all those documents, even those that are linked, into a single data set that will also be put on the website, so you'll be able to download all the documents that were used and not necessarily rely on links that have a tendency to go stale, get broken over time, which is very annoying. Okay, we're now on B, subsidence. This is subsidence through 2017. Primary data sets that we used was the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory data sets. They were 2016 and 2017. We used a lot of information from USGS, which is also part of that INSAR with respect to USGS. But there's been INSAR, especially in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast. There was some INSAR data that we were using. The plate boundary observation was an excellent source, especially in Southern California, to look at various locations where to try to fine tune with what we're looking at to see does it make any sense, things like that. So we tried to use those as much as possible. They're also located throughout the rest of the state, Central Valley. They're for plate tectonics. California is a very active state. Things are moving, so it gives us the X, Y, and Z axis of a lot of locations. But they are point data. And, they're situated in places where they're expecting to see plate movement. And we just try to piggyback on that information as well. We also have extensometers mostly throughout the Central Valley. We looked at that information as well, and then published local and regional documents that we could find. Again, all that will be shortly available as part of the documentation package that will be offered. Salient intrusion. This is another one where it was mostly published local and regional documents. We also looked at the California Water Plan Groundwater Update 2013. This affects mostly, but most of the places that were susceptible to salient intrusion were obviously coastal, and then around the bay. The Bay Area has some interesting areas in there. Water quality degradation. This was the only one of the four that wasn't the yes or no answer. Do you have subsidence, yes or no? In this particular case, this was based off of data sets that we acquired through GeoTracker, the Gamma system. We also used the contaminant level. We had two. We had one earlier, and then we had to update it in November 2017. Because our original data set also included chromium-6, but that has since been ruled in court to be not valid, so we had to back that out. So we had to use an updated version. It's also included in a document that we produced as Appendix 2, and it includes both primary and secondary MCL values. And then we also used the public supply well data set that we received, which was used in Component 3. This too was broken into two categories. First part was basically to determine the magnitude or the MCL exceedance number. So if MCL was 10 parts per million and you were at 100, that was a 10x exceedance. And basically all the different components that were detected in that basin, exceeded in that basin, we calculated that magnitude factor and then averaged them to come up with an average MCL exceedance, and then we applied it to a breakpoint system. The second part of it relates to more spatially how many public supply wells within the basins have, how many individual wells throughout the basin, public supply wells, have been impacted with some level of exceedances of different contaminants. So we had more of a spatial, is it 50% of the wells, 10% of the wells? The one drawback that I didn't cover when I discussed the public supply well database is that we only looked at active wells within the basin at a given snapshot in time back in 2017 or 16, whatever we called it. Wells come in and out of that data set as active or inactive, depending on its status. It could be taken offline due to water quality, it could be taken offline for maintenance, or it could be taken offline for demand, or just simply destroyed. So there's a lot of factors that bring it in and out. So that's why we use that data set, and we said only active wells. So sometimes there's a little disparity between how many wells have MCL exceedances versus how many active wells. So we had to handle that as well in this process, which is also documented in the manual. Evaluating impacts on local habitat and stream flow. Trevor talked about this a little earlier. This is new for basin prioritization. It was not part of the 2014. This is we had to work with different agencies and organizations to try to build a data set that would map where these natural communities are. These communities are associated with groundwater. So we created this data set. This was work done by CDFW, the Nature Conservancy, DWR, of course, and also there was some off-and-on conversations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA Fisheries concerning what would be in and what would be out and things like that. That data set has been online for roughly a month or so. It's also on the DWR website. You can access all the different layers that went into constructing that data set, as well as downloading and pulling information related to your basin. That took care of the habitat side of that equation, and then we used the National Hydrology Data Set, NHD. That data set is also available at, as you can see, the website, and we used that and only looked at the permanent and perennial streams, and things that were intermittent or things like that. We didn't necessarily use those. It was a little harder for us to justify using that. So pretty much anything that was permanent or perennial, we flagged as being in that basin. And this again is a yes or no kind of approach on both of these. Are there natural communities within the basin? Yes, the flag was set. Are there streams that are permanent and perennial in that basin or adjacent to that basin? And if the answer is yes, flag was set. And then we used both the groundwater reliance information, which was pretty much the groundwater volume that was normalized on the acreage of the basin. So it was groundwater acre feet per acre value, as well as whether or not that there's groundwater level decline in the basin, and then whether there are monitoring is occurring. Obviously, in most cases, the last two go hand in hand. There's got to be monitoring to know. But there are places where groundwater level declines are going on, but they don't submit data to SGMP. And the reason we had to do it this way was because there's 282 basins out there that we know of that are monitoring groundwater levels, and there's another 235 that are not monitoring. So we had to be able to process both of those kinds of scenarios to be able to answer the question, could natural communities / habitat and stream flow be impacted by groundwater activities? So that was the approach that we took for resolving this particular component. Okay, then there's the other information, and this is basin level after doing basin level evaluation. And this is actual potential challenges for groundwater management and challenges for sustainability, things like that. So the data set on this is, when it was applicable, it was local knowledge reports, regional studies, and studies. There's a lot of research that goes on out there in a lot of places. So we relied a lot on that to answer some of these questions. Okay, now we're into 8C, 8D, and 8E, which are analysis that we performed in order to determine the likelihood whether the basin was going to be a very low priority or a high priority, or in the case, a sigma priority. The first analysis we did involved with groundwater level or groundwater volume. If the basin was less than 2,000 acre feet of groundwater per year, and the second one was greater than 2,000 but less than or equal to 9,500 and had no documented impacts. In order to answer those two questions, of course, we had to use groundwater reliance. It was the groundwater volumes associated with component 6A, and it was the documented impacts identified in 7. So any one of those 4, A, B, C, or D, but only if they had documented impacts points. So each one of those 4, A, B, C, and D, calculate their own individual points, which are then added up and run through a breakpoint. And depending on where those points total up and where they show up in that breakpoint is how many documented impact points they give for number 7. So there is a possibility that it takes at least 3 to get 1 documented impact point. I had to say that because you can have 1 point, say, for water quality and not get any documented impact points. The second is if there was documented impacts associated with the habitat and stream flow. That was component 8.A. And the second one is there documented impacts that potentially could be impacting the groundwater management or sustainability of the basin. So those are the 3 that we looked, or those 2 data sets, 4 different sections that we used to answer this question. And it affected quite a few basins, one way or the other. Then the next test that analysis we did that Trevor mentioned earlier was had to do with the non-adjudicated basin area in relation to the adjudication throughout the state. The statement that the analysis that we did to answer this question, basin's non-adjudicated portion extracts less than or equal to 9,500 acre feet of groundwater. Now, to do that, we had to use several different data sets. We had to build a data set which basically takes the adjudicated shapefile that's online on DWR and our basin boundaries, and basically create 2 shapefiles, or 2 basin boundaries, one that shows that this basin is adjudicated in this portion and non-adjudicated in the second portion. And then we had to compute the groundwater volume for the non-adjudicated portion of that basin. And we just basically went back to basically 6A and redid that process for the non-adjudicated portion. And that's all that information associated with the volumes is provided in Appendix 3. And the details associated with the basin boundaries being adjusted for the non-adjudication portion is also provided in Appendix 4. And then we just simply used to calculate urban, we needed a population, so we used the 2010 population for the non-adjudicated portion of the basin. Critically overdrafted basins and out-of-basin groundwater substitution transfers and groundwater exports. Again, these are new for 2018. Per Bulletin 118 Interim Update 2016, we identified 21 basins to be subject or in critical overdraft. Those basins were then flagged in basin prioritization for critically overdrafted, and then for the out-of-basin groundwater substitution transfers or groundwater exports, we relied on DWR Bulletin 132, which is the management of California State Water Project, where they track the arranged or coordinated substitution, transfers, conveyance, things of that nature, as well as published annual reports for basins to get a sense of what was going on with respect to that. Anyway, so that was also flagged for special consideration within basin prioritization. I reached the end. Stephen will now cover the resources and next steps.
All right, thank you, Roy. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Stephen Springhorn, and as Roy mentioned, I'll be covering the basin prioritization resources that our team has put together to make the 2018 basin prioritization results available, as well as some related data sets and information. And also talk about the next steps, which includes the timeline from here on out for the rest of the basin prioritization process, and some information on how to provide public comments related to this basin prioritization. So I'll start with the basin prioritization resources, and there's two sort of key resources that are available. And they're available at this website that's on the top of the slide here. The first is the Basin Prioritization webpage. This is the hub for all things basin prioritization, and where you can access the variety of other related data sets that are here. On this website, Basin Prioritization website, there's also a Basin Prioritization dashboard that allows you to look at the draft 2018 results across the state on an interactive map, and look at the components that Roy mentioned for each individual basin. So I'll do a quick demo for each one of these resources so you get a better feel of what is available on these sites. So this is a view of the Basin Prioritization webpage. I want to start with just how to access this information or this webpage. Starting from Department of Water Resources homepage, you go to Programs, Groundwater Management, and on the main Groundwater Management webpage, there is a link for Basin Prioritization. So on the Basin Prioritization website, there's some introductory information that Trevor covered, a summary of this process and past prioritization processes, a map of the draft results, as well as on the top right here, a link to a dedicated Sigma email that you can send comments or send questions for clarification, and we'll touch on this in some subsequent slides. Also on this site is additional information on the water code requirements that we are following for basin prioritization that Trevor touched on. Some historical information on the 2014 basin prioritization, and then the 2018 release of basin prioritization, which includes three main areas or components. The first is the dashboard, which I'll demo in a second. The second is the basin prioritization process document that Roy went over. This is a draft document, and it has the process or an explanation of the process and the results and other related information in this document. The third component there are the spreadsheets and related data sets that are posted on our California Natural Resources Association Open Data Platform. I'll quickly open this so you can see there's some explanation on what this information is, and these data sets are available in a variety of formats for you to access and review as needed. The next component on the website is the timeline and next steps. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on this, but this information is here on the webpage. Just stepping back quickly, there is a link to a figure that Trevor showed earlier of the draft results of 2018. There's also a a timeline graphic that shows how this prioritization process is related to some other existing activities, SGMA-related activities, and we'll touch on more of that in a second. Also, this is where to provide or submit public comments related to basin prioritization. So information on the public meetings, you can view submitted public comments, as well as this is where you submit your public comments. We also have a number of frequently asked questions related to prioritization. And so you can click on a link to download all of them in a PDF form, or you can click on an individual question that you're interested in and get more information here. And so there's a number of related questions on this page. So now what I'll do is I'll quickly demo the basin prioritization dashboard that our team has developed. So again, that's the first link on the web page. And it opens up an interactive map viewer that has some introductory information here. And so what opens up is an interactive map where you can zoom in, you can search by a particular address or location here in the search bar. The other key features here are the map layers. There's the basin prioritization information, both 2018, and you can compare 2014 to 2018 and see the change. There's also reference layers, so critically overdrafted basins that Roy mentioned, adjudicated areas, hydrologic regions, prior version of basin boundaries, counties, and regional offices. Another tool here is you can change the base map if you're interested in looking at satellite imagery. You can download data, and you can look at information in a tab format. And we'll go into these features in a second. There's also a tutorial. So if you're brand new to this site, you can step through a tutorial that gives you the general feel of the various features on this map if that's needed. And then there is a information window that has the content that Roy described of the process and data sets for each component. So it's essentially some background information and context for each one of these components that were used for prioritization. So now let's look at some of the basin-specific information. So we can zoom in here into the location where we are at here today in Sacramento, our home basin, the South American Groundwater Basin. When you click on a basin, you're able to see the priority and the points, and then information for each component that Roy described that we use for this particular basin. So, and if you're interested in what that component is, you can click on the component title there, and it gives you the information related to that specific component. So components 1 through 8, all this information is here for every basin in the state. So all the 517. It also provides links to additional information that Roy described. And then you're able to download the data for your particular basin that's highlighted, or provide questions or ask questions for clarification at this SGMA program email address. As you can see, if we select other basins, you can see the information changes, and so it is specific to the individual basin. So one other thing that's on this panel for each individual basin is individual graphs of the components, each component population growth that Roy went over, and where that particular basin ranks within all the basins in the state. Another way to look at the information. As I mentioned, if we zoom back out here to a statewide look, You can see the difference between the 2014 prioritization and this draft 2018 prioritization results, and you can see which basins went from low or very low to medium or high, or from medium or high to low or very low. Some additional tools here that are also on this are, again, the basin-specific information. There's a filter function here where you can filter the results by particular queries or user-defined queries. And then you can also, this links in our website or where you can comment. So you can actually submit comments from the tool, but this is utilizing that same public comment feature that's on our basin prioritization webpage. Okay, so now we'll go back to the presentation and move on to the basin prioritization timeline and next steps. So this is the anticipated schedule and sequence of steps that we plan to use to finalize the 2014 SGMA prioritization. Again, these dates are subject to change, but this is what we're currently working under. So the public comment period opened May 18th. That's when the draft results were released. We're having a webinar today, and we plan to have a series of public meetings the week of June 25th, and there will be some additional information or details on the specific locations and dates for those venues in the very near future, and those will be posted on our basin prioritization webpage. The public comment period closes. It's a 60-day public comment period. Closes on July 18th. The goal is to finalize the prioritization for basins that are unmodified as part of the 2018 basin boundary modification, and we'll touch on that in a second, in the mid-October timeframe. So there is, as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of different related SGMA activities going on. Basin prioritization, which as Trevor mentioned, is a result of the 2016 basin boundary modifications. There is a current basin boundary modification window open right now, and there'll be these multiple projects will be aligned, and I'll show that on the next slide. But the prioritization based on the 2018 basin boundary modifications, the plan is to release draft prioritizations for the modified basins, if there are basins that are modified as part of that basin boundary process. In late October, there will be a public comment period for that reprioritization, and then final prioritization for those modified basins would be in the early 2019 timeframe. So as I mentioned, this timeline of these various related activities is available on the website there on the screen on our basin prioritization website. It's hard to see here on the screen, but you can see these three distinct and related projects, the 2018 SGMA basin prioritization that we're talking about today, the 2018 basin boundary modification process that's currently underway with the submission period that ends June 30th, and then the 2018 basin prioritization related to any basins that change as a result of this next round of basin boundary modifications. So how to provide public comments, and then and some additional information on the public meetings. On the public meetings, I mentioned that those will be held in late June, the week of June 25th, and more details on those dates and locations will be available soon. The public comment period opens the 18th and will run for 60 days and close on the July 18th. Public comments on the draft prioritization results can be submitted and viewed using the basin prioritization website that I showed earlier. So here's a screenshot of that part of the website where you can view the public meeting information as well as view submitted public comments and submit new public comments here. There is an important distinction between providing questions for clarification to that email that I mentioned earlier, and official public comments. So those we're requesting all official public comments on prioritization be submitted through this this website, and any related data sets that accompany those public comments need to be submitted to this website as well, if you are planning to submit additional data. So some highlights on how to provide effective comments on prioritization. We're looking for comments that focus directly on the draft 2018 SGMA Basin prioritization results, and also comments that identify the specific water code components that Roy touched on that are being commented on, or specific references or citations that are being provided related to those various components of basin prioritization. As I just briefly mentioned, the supporting data that are submitted as part of a comment or with comments should be consistent with the 2018 basin prioritization process and results document that I showed on the screen and that Roy went over. And so there are some different avenues here, as I just mentioned. So future questions for clarification, so again, not public comments, can be submitted. We want to centralize those questions for clarification that aren't addressed today to that SGMA program email, the sgmps@water.ca.gov. Again, official public comments should be submitted via the Basin Prioritization webpage, which the link there is at the bottom of the screen. We also have our local contacts related to the SGMA program and basin prioritization in our 4 regional offices. Northern Region office in Red Bluff, Bill Ehorn is the contact there. Our North Central Region office in West Sacramento, Bill Brewster is the contact there. And then our South Central Regional office is Dane Mathis, and that's in the Fresno office. And then our Southern Region office is in Glendale, and that's Timothy Ross. So as Trevor mentioned, those basins that moved from low or very low to medium or high and are starting their new path into SGMA after these results are finalized, there are a number of services and support that DWR provides. So planning, technical, and financial support. And we are planning to continue those services. And there's additional information on those variety of services on our main DWR Sustainable Groundwater Management Program website, which is, the link is there on the screen. And another good source of information on the latest info and updates on the DWR SGMA program, if you sign up for the email newsletter that goes out, it's a bi-weekly newsletter that has current events and more information on those variety of services and data and tools that we have available for the basin, for the stakeholders and GSAs in the basin throughout the state. So with that, I'll turn it over now to Stephanie, and she'll walk through the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So this is the time for clarifying questions. We've received a few over the course of this webinar, which is wonderful. To remind you all of how you can submit those clarifying questions, use that questions box on your control panel. And remember that this is for clarifying questions on the presentations that you've heard today. If you want to provide a formal public comment, again, as Stephen indicated, you would go to the Basin Prioritization webpage on DWR's website for those official public comments that will be posted publicly. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Stephen to moderate the questions we've received.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. So we do have a number of questions here. So we'll be, we have our colleagues from the SGMA program, Simmer Denota and Tim Godwin, that are helping us stage the questions. And Tim will be reading out the questions, and our team here will be answering the questions. So go ahead, Tim.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So we'll start off, we've been talking a bit about the comments, but I'll dive right into that one because I think it's a strong one. Is DWR accepting comments on the priorities for all basins, including those for which the priority did not change?
Yeah, real short answer, yes. I mean, we accept comments on all the basins, regardless of the changing in priority, even regardless of whether it changes from low or very low to medium or high, or vice versa.
Great. I'm going to simplify this one a little bit just so it can be applied across the state. But why are the out-of-basin groundwater substitution transfers selected for the Sacramento Valley? You know, where basins are considered healthy. Why is this component added in this case?
This is a really good question that kind of gets at another point we perhaps failed to mention, is what prioritization really means. Prioritization is not a judgment by the Department of Sustainability or even a judgment as it relates to whether there's groundwater management or sufficient groundwater management or sustainable groundwater management. It's really just a characterization that, identification, I should say, of the importance of groundwater management as it relates to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So whether there are basins that are medium or high, or even if those have changed priority from medium to high, it doesn't indicate at all a statement by the department that they are unsustainable in any way. It just recognizes the importance for them to be managed in accordance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
So we've had a pretty limited list of questions. However, some are still flowing in. And give me just a moment here, see if we can pull another one in.
You know, I do see a question, Tim, if I could just add, there seems to be a question related to groundwater substitution transfers. And I want to make a statement here that, you know, the state does not in any way feel that the groundwater substitution transfers aren't important. In fact, quite the opposite. This is something that we encourage as one of the tools to reach statewide water management. And so groundwater substitution transfers, back to my prior point, potentially have a risk of greater significant impacts. And so should be done in accordance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So it's not a judgment in any way that they are not achieving their goals related to those programs, but should be done in accordance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
So this question in regards to the priority point ranges and how these components were broken down and characterized. Was there a new methodology applied that changed these ranges and the minimums and maximums? How did these components roll up to defining the priority, I think is what we're really after in the question.
There's a couple of pieces to that. Number one, we wanted to try to maintain as much consistency between 2014 and 2018 and not have a lot of uncertainty with respect to people understanding where they kind of reside. They would be able to look at that and be able to predict if there's changes occurring in their basin, where they would actually, how that would impact their prioritization. Number two, another factor is that the previous prioritization did not consider all the factors that are in 2018, such as the habitat and stream flow. So we increased the number of points from 40 to 42 So we had to make some allowances for that increase. So that's why we went from like 13.42 for a medium to greater than 14 was for a better distribution, taking into consideration those extra points. So we didn't change the points to maintain consistency and public understanding of what we're looking for. And then we also had to allow for some changes due to new requirements on the prioritization.
Thanks, Roy. So since we're on the topic of some of the more detailed components, was there a specific threshold used in determining the potential impact to infrastructure for the subsidence component?
No, because it was really difficult for us to determine that a particular infrastructure impact, so the subsidence is causing a canal to drop in the center, reducing water volume and things like that. It was really hard for us to make any kind of assessment to say that this was more important or more of an impact infrastructure than another place. That there's just no easy way to determine that in the scope of basin prioritization. So we treated subsidence essentially as it was a yes or a no. Is there subsidence occurring in that basin due to groundwater activities?
Great. And then I guess to drill in a little further on the public supply well, there's a question regarding the timing of the querying of the database. Is there any significance to us pulling the data from March 2016? Why didn't we update it for early 2018?
Well, we pulled the data when we back in March in 2016. Remember, there's a lot of different components to this thing, and it was a snapshot in time to give us an idea of what was being used in that basin. If we probably pulled it today, we might get a slightly different number, but it would be different wells. So there really wasn't a whole lot of importance in trying to keep that data set updated. Plus, there's a rather long process for getting through to final approval to be able to release this. So at the time when we started that process, it was a rather young data set.
Great. We'll jump back kind of on the topic you touched on earlier, Trevor. Are there any additional, or Stephen, are there any additional requirements from SGMA when you consider high priority versus medium priority?
So again, the short answer there is SGMA treats these two priorities the same way. And so therefore, there's really no difference in the requirements for high or medium priority basins. So that being said, SGMA applies to all groundwater basins identified in Bulletin 118, but SGMA requires that all high and medium priority basins be managed under a GSP or alternative. So for those low and very low basins, SGMA encourages and authorizes the development of a GSP or alternative, but does not require it.
Great. Looking forward to the future, other than the event that a basin boundary modification should occur coming up, is there any other mechanism to trigger basin prioritization moving forward?
The best way to answer that is we have no plans to further evaluate prioritization in the foreseeable future, meaning the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years. That's the current plan. It's always possible that that could be subject to change. But as you point out, Tim, with the exception of basins that are modified as part of this second round of basin boundary modifications, those basins that are modified, we have an obligation to look at late this year and hopefully finalize that prioritization of just those basins, as Stephen mentioned in his portion of the presentation.
Great. Again, some more technical information regarding how we accumulated the base data sets here. In looking at the OSCAR database, did we take into account that there are destroyed or inactive wells in our data set and getting those total well counts for these basins?
Well, the short answer is no. But the long answer is that currently the data set from Oscar is essentially an accumulation of all the wells, and we're not tracking or matching destroyed wells versus installed wells, which is unfortunate. But that's a lot of work to go back and try to figure out all that. So no, we didn't. But the other downside to that is that not all well logs are submitted to DWR. So we don't receive all the logs, whether it's destroyed or whether it's a new well log. So the reconciliation of that is probably next to impossible at this point.
Okay. Thanks, Roy. Looking at component 8C, C1 and C2, those being, I believe, the effect on stream flow and habitat.
No, that's not.
Is that correct? Sorry, I'm probably drawing it wrong.
Those are the 2,000 and 9,500, 8C1 and 8C2.
Right. Are those components, those metrics, are they always the overriding consideration, regardless of point? I mean, how do those fit into where these things get ranked with regards to the other component point totals?
That's a test analysis that's done. I mean, the whole point of basin prioritization and the whole point of Sigma is related to groundwater and its groundwater use. If the basin is, nobody's pumping any groundwater in that basin. You know, at some point you have to be reasonable and say, well, you know, should they develop a groundwater management plan if they're not pumping any groundwater? So those same numbers were used in 2014. We also used them in 2018. In a way to basically say, you know, there's no groundwater volume. And it's amazing that there are a lot of basins out there that do not pump any groundwater. So we wanted to be able to capture that and basically identify that. There are some basins, because of some of the other criteria, because of population and other circumstances, they could be all irrigated acreage. However, it's all surface water is the source. So they could end up having a very large number of points, but in the end, they don't pump any groundwater or not a sufficient amount of groundwater in order to make the cut.
Sorry, the questions keep trickling in. We're trying to get them canned. We're going to try and respond to as many as we can. There are some very specific questions that, you know, I'd be happy to drill down a little bit deeper on in person or with specific basins or prioritizations in mind. This one here, the process results documented notes that all agriculture mapped in the 2014 data set was assumed to be irrigated unless a field had been previously identified by DWR as dry farmed. Does that include prior designations made in earlier DWR land use maps?
Not specifically. We worked with the land use folks in the different regional offices. They used current knowledge of what was going on, in particular the year 2014. So if it was dry farmed in 2008, that wasn't what our criteria was. What was its condition? What was its irrigation source or not? And it had to do with 2014. So we might use the older DWR land use surveys to try to identify some of those, but then we applied 2014 knowledge to it.
Okay.
All right, so it looks like we might take a short break our pause just to compile if there's any other questions that come in. So if, again, you have any questions for clarification on what was presented today, please submit those. So we'll look for those and compile them. So we'll just take a quick pause here to do that. All right, looks like we have a few additional questions. Go ahead, Tim.
Yep. So a question here on how subsidence was applied. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
When I went through that one slide where we talked about the subsidence, I talked about all the different documents and data sets, USGS, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and documents. And I also said that we looked at subsidence only in terms of if they are currently having subsidence, then the flag was established, meaning it was said, yes, you have current subsidence. That had its own point value. The other aspect of subsidence we looked at was whether or not it occurred in the past or concerns that if the basin is not managed, that it could potentially happen again. So we wanted to make sure that that was identified in basin prioritization, but certainly got less points for that. But those were the only two criteria we used. Is it occurring today or did it occur in the past? We did not make any determination whether it is significant, insignificant, greater than or less than, or more damaging or less damaging. There was no comparison between them.
Great. I guess another question on, speaking of details of these components, how population was applied in component 6 versus component 1. You know, what were those data sets that you relied upon for those?
Well, the data set that I used for 2018 purely came from OSCAR, the new system that we currently have. The data set that was used in 2014 came from several different data sets. And the significant difference between the two, and reason why we gave a 25% weighting had to do with the fact that earlier I said that I was waiting for the data set because we were scanning and keying several 100,000 well logs. So the data set today is a more accurate reflection of what we know and what we have, and the last one was based on what we knew and what we had at the time, but we knew we were missing logs out of the system. So we discounted it by 25%. So that was the reason for the discount back in 2014.
All right. I don't think I was clear with my question for you. I think you answered there about the specific logs, the well logs themselves versus the population. So the question being asked is, for component 6, we used a third-party population data from 2014. So we used the 2014 data there for population. Why not use the component 1 population rather than, or component 1 population rather than 2010? Why not use 2010 data for the population?
Well, we did use 2010 population for component one.
Okay.
We have a question through email too. Question reads, currently our basin is shown as pumping less than 2,000 acre feet, which of course is the threshold for which the basin is deemed very low. In the future, if it's found to be more than 2,000 acre feet, what happens? How often does DWR reprioritize basins? So, good question. You know, we will only evaluate this when we do reprioritization. As I mentioned, we are not anticipating reprioritizing basins perhaps 3 to 5 years, but it's again based on whether there are basin boundary modifications, and that triggers our role to reevaluate and consider prioritization. So if pumping were to go up or down now between us reprioritizing basins, really nothing happens from our perspective. We are not, this is not kind of a real-time, if you will, analysis to evaluate the priority of basins. It only happens at specific times when we look at this due to basin boundary modifications.
Great. With regard to irrigated acreage and groundwater use, were regional climates considered as factors affecting crop irrigation demands, or were stock values applied statewide?
So the short answer for that is yes. Yes, we did make regional climates. I'm trying to read the question at the same time trying to answer it. Okay, let me go back and explain how we looked at that information. Each basin was looked at in terms of its precip, its soil moisture. We used a tool or an model called calcimeta. So all the regional down to what we call a detailed analysis unit was processed. So we looked at cropping patterns, irrigated acreage, we looked at planting and harvesting times, we looked at precip, soil moisture, and I'm sure a host of other things. I mean, there's some modelers that would probably know all the details. But yes, we looked at all that, and each basin was individually processed for that. And the land use folks who's been working with them for many years have been keeping up on top of all that information.
Great. I think we've worked through our questions that we've tried to consolidate. Any last thoughts here, Stephen?
All right, so we'll wait a few more minutes to see if there's any questions, additional questions that are coming in. Again, these questions are for clarification on the information that was presented during the webinar today. So we'll pause just for a moment to see if any questions come in, and we'll be back in just a moment.
All right, thanks for keeping the comments coming. We've had a couple more. So a lot of data is based on the draft California Water Plan 2018, which is not final draft document. How can there be certainty in the data? Could it change and certain values change as things move forward?
Well, both the plan and basin prioritization are draft at this point. So public comments are coming in for us on basin prioritization as well as us for the water plan. The data sets that we used out of the water plan were basically stable data sets, population information and forecasting that have been basically repeated with respect to water plans of the past. They've been forecasting 2030, 2040, 2050. So we just picked up on the same data set, as well as other information. Now, they do report on information going on with the conditions around the state that we also looked at. And certainly, if any of that data changes, it would be a good idea to discuss that with respect to an individual basin. So if it's not correct, that's the whole point of a draft process here. So if you have other information, we should consider.
Sorry, we're getting a couple more comments. I'm just trying to understand how to consolidate them. Great. Okay, so one more question regarding some of these components, specifically saline water intrusion. Seems that Bulletin 118/2003 defines saline intrusion without regard to the cause of the intrusion, but it implies that occurrence of saline intrusion is a condition that is observed to have changed over time. Did the evaluation being the prioritization process, attempt to determine whether salinity concentrations have changed over time?
So the answer to that is no. The approach we took on that was whether or not it is occurring currently. We did not take into consideration any other factor, meaning is it abated, is it getting worse, only because it's a very fluid. It's a very fluid type situation tomorrow, today. So no, we did not make any assessment over its current condition other than it exists.
Right. Okay. We're down to the last question here. Do you anticipate that public comments will be an effective tool for refining the results of the prioritization?
Yeah, I can handle that one. Yeah, we definitely do feel that public comments are going to be a part of this. It's an important reminder that these are draft results, and we're looking to see if there's information that comes in that over this 60-day public comment period that we could use, and that might mean that some of these results that are in draft now might change between draft and final. So again, those type of comments we're looking for that would be submitted through the Basin prioritization webpage that's on the screen there on the right are comments that focus directly on the draft 2018 prioritization results. Again, comments that identify the specific water code components or that are being commented on, and specific references or citations that are included in those comments. And again, if there's supporting data that are out there in those basins that you're wanting to submit with your comment or associated with your comment, we're asking you to include that information with your comment as you submit it through the web page And so there's a way that as you're submitting those comments, you can attach a variety of attachments if necessary to get that information to us. So if there is a question that you have in between now and the public meetings, just wanted to highlight that those public meetings the week of June 25th will be a good opportunity for us to communicate with interested parties on the basin prioritization. And so we'll be at a few different locations throughout the state that week of the 25th in June. And again, more information on the specific locations and specific dates and times will be coming very shortly on our webpage. So with that, it looks like we have all the questions answered, and we can wrap things up. I'd like to thank all of you that tuned in today to hear about this important SGMA project and provide feedback to us, and we look forward to seeing all of you at the public meetings. And again, thanks to our team here for pulling this together and working on this project. So with that, we'll sign off, and thanks everyone.